the past 15 years have been arguably the 15 years that have seen the greatest successes ever in global health. Child mortality is down nearly 50% since 1990. Maternal mortality has dropped by nearly the same amount. HIV, TB, and malaria have decreased by 40%. And while obviously the proximate cause for those improvements has been direct interventions, from greater vaccination rates to wider distributions of ARVs, I would argue that increasingly smart, targeted advocacy at both the global and national levels has been a critical indirect cause. Most notably, the Millennium Development Goals, which were set in 2000 at the UN, set clear, measurable targets with a deadline, 2015, next year, to reduce maternal and child mortality by set targets, to reduce child mortality by 2/3 and maternal mortality by 3/4, and to slow the spread of HIV/AIDS. These provided a clear framework that allowed advocates to push for and hold governments accountable for delivery and execution. Indeed, a new paper that came out just last month that compared the trends in decline of child mortality from before the MDGs, so this is the period between 1990 to 2000, that actually goes into a couple of different scenarios, to after they were adopted, suggests that at least 7.5 million extra lives, and perhaps as many as 14 million, have already been saved that would not have been had we not had that kind of framework, which is essentially an advocacy framework. Now, it's tough to do those kind of, one of the challenges with advocacy is how do you draw the connection between that kind of targeted goal setting attention and the outputs. But this is about as good a test as you can do, and we have very clear answers. And so that's why 2015, as we head into it, is such a pivotal year, because the global community will be formulating a new plan for action around this. And even as the agenda widens, as seems very likely, it's critical for us all to try and make sure that it retains at its core a succinct set of easy-to-understand health targets similar to the ones in the current MDGs. That's key to achieving the goal of largely eliminating inequity in health outcomes between rich and poor countries, as set out in the recent Lancet Commission on Investing in Health, which I hope most of you are aware of, and those who aren't, I encourage you to look at, because it is itself a very powerful advocacy tool that makes a persuasive case of the wider economic benefits of smart investments in health. And as it happens, 2015 is also going to be the 15th anniversary of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So what I really would like to do today is use a couple of examples to basically reflect on our own journey in global health and share some of what we learned about how public health advocacy can help reinforce and drive results and outcomes in key areas. Like as Oying's already mentioned, I came to the foundation in 2007 after 7 years at the United Nations, where I was actually involved in the development, the original development of the MDGs. And what drew me to move from the East Coast to the Pacific Northwest, which seemed on the surface very far away from the problems in Africa and Asia and elsewhere we were trying to solve, was the sense that there was a real opportunity at the foundation to make a difference at the institution that had some more flexibility and a more targeted focus on achieving impact in key areas. In fact, Bill and Melinda started the foundation with a very simple but powerful promise that every person should have the right to a healthy and productive life. And outside the US, our focus is on identifying critical gaps in health and development where we can make a catalytic difference. We try not to replicate good work that others are doing. We're not a boots-on-the-ground organization, although we do have some modest presence in different regions, as Oying referenced. But our real opportunity to serve as a catalyst, to be a little bit of an honest broker, a convener. Can we bring ideas? Can we leverage our resources? Can we leverage our partners in order to get results that are far bigger than what we would be able to do if we simply work directly? And much of our agenda is focused on global health. Strategies, investments, obviously, in key areas like family planning, nutrition, maternal health, newborn child health, vaccines. And vaccines is one of the examples I'd really like to focus on today, because it's our single largest area of investment, and we believe that vaccines are one of the best buys in global health. The story of how we got involved in vaccines is interesting. In 1997, Bill and Melinda were reading the newspaper and came across a pie chart breaking down the major causes of death among children. And they were very surprised to learn that one of the biggest causes of death, killing 500,000 children a year, was rotavirus, a disease they hadn't even heard of. Now, simply the fact that that was in a newspaper article, which is itself, as a former journalist, a form of advocacy, shows you how, first and foremost, getting information out is the key to getting results and outcomes and getting clear information. And what affected them very deeply was that most of those 500,000 children died because they lived in countries that simply didn't have access to basic either, there wasn't a vaccine at that stage, but even the treatments, oral rehydration salts, other very basic treatments weren't available. At the time, Bill was in his early 40s, Melinda in her mid-30s. Bill was still running Microsoft, and they were starting a family. They had planned to do philanthropy later, at some future stage. But as Bill said recently, seeing that pie chart back in 1997 set him on fire. And when they realized that researchers were testing a vaccine to protect children from rotavirus, Bill and Melinda decided to do everything they could to help drive that vaccine production forward and get it to every child who needed it. And as they got more engaged, it became clear it's not simply about technology, but it's delivery. How do you get the systems and the evidence and the policy guidance to help countries and governments, donors and developing countries understand what to invest in? And then also, how do you bring the cost down? These are expensive, so that you can actually reach as many children as possible. These challenges led to the foundation to provide seed money to create Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. The basic theory of Gavi, which I hope many of you are familiar with, is relatively simple. Just align the efforts and resources and expertise of governments, the private sector, and multilateral organizations so that everybody is pulling from the same end of the rope against this critically important goal. And more specifically, by actually pooling the financial resources of donors and the demand for vaccines, we're able to increase capacity and competitiveness of manufacturers and drive down costs. That spurred manufacturers to offer vaccine at unprecedented prices. In just a 2-year period, the cost of immunizing a child with pentavalent pneumococcal and rotavirus vaccines has gone down by 35%. So since its inception now, 14 years ago, the Alliance has helped developing countries reach an additional 440 million children with life-saving vaccines, averting an estimated 6 million deaths. Today, 32 of the world's poorest countries are now scheduled to give that rotavirus vaccine, which didn't exist back then when Bill and Melinda read the article, and that number is going to climb to 40 by next year. But we know nothing in global health is ever simple. Many developing countries still struggle to afford vaccines, and Gavi's impact relies on its ability to actually mobilize those resources from donor governments. And that's an area where advocacy, again, is absolutely essential. To tell Gavi's story, which I think is one of the most powerful stories there is in global health, and why it's such an incredibly cost-effective investment in terms of lives saved. To help get that message out, the Foundation both speaks and advocates directly. We partner with Gavi, who themselves obviously speak to their own results. And we also fund advocacy partners, from the One Campaign to the UN Foundation to Save the Children, all of whom share those goals to how do we generate real constituencies of support, both among the general public and among key policymakers. And that's all critical to helping make sure that donors do step up. And 3 years ago, we saw the results when Gavi held a pledging conference, and a conference that was hosted by the UK government, who's played a real leadership role in this space. And $4.3 billion was raised then, enough to immunize more than 250 million more children. And this January, we now have another moment, because these replenishment rounds come every 3 years, and it's a tough period in 3 years because of the state of the global economy, and particularly the economy of most traditional donors. But we're hoping with the German government on January 27th to raise even more money. We hope up to around $7.5 billion for an even more ambitious target to reach more kids, but also we now have more vaccines. The flip side of developing new vaccines against it is we then have more opportunities to save more lives. So your sticker goes up, but the impact is much wider. But that's still a very tricky case to make when you're going around government by government and you have new challenges. For example, the Ebola response I just cited. I know there's some real nervousness that the reality is money that's critically needed and should go to Ebola now divert away from a kind of long-term investment that we need in Gavi and coming up in a couple of months. And how do we manage to do both and create the demand and understand the need for both? And that's also essential on sort of developing countries. Surprising as it may sound, when Gavi was first ramping up support for these vaccines, it wasn't clear there was enough country demand, despite vaccines being one of the most cost-effective interventions around. And since they were being rolled out faster than ever, many policymakers just didn't have a clear understanding of impact. So to address this challenge, we've also worked to provide sort of collateral research on that effectiveness and necessity, research that can go not just to health ministries, but also to finance ministries and heads of state and be used in local media. And the goal is to educate decision makers on that impact. And I think we do now have a powerful constituency of champions. But even on something as clear cut as that, it's still a continued heavy lift where you need this kind of targeted advocacy. Advocacy is essentially about leverage. It's about trying to get other partners from whatever sector aligned around a common set of objectives, which we think and we believe, because we're very much at the Gates Foundation, believe in evidence-based advocacy. Everything that we advocate for, we think, has a very strong grounding in interventions that we are confident have a dramatic impact, whether it's driving down child mortality or increasing the access to family planning for women in need. And building those coalitions, then driving them forward, and then building on that success.